Millionaire sees little girl crying in the corner of the airplane. What she says leaves him in despair. Just before we start, drop a flag emoji that represents your country. Richard Hartwell adjusted his platinum watch as the first-class cabin filled with the usual symphony of privilege. Leather creaking, champagne glasses clinking, hushed conversations about stock portfolios. At 58, he commanded respect in every room he entered. His steel-grey eyes had closed million-dollar deals. His handshake had sealed corporate empires. Yet tonight, something felt different. The Boeing 777 bound for Chicago was half empty, a Tuesday evening flight that catered to business travelers like himself. Richard had chosen seat 2A deliberately, maximum legroom, minimal human interaction. After the Henderson merger celebration in New York, he craved solitude, but solitude was impossible when a child was sobbing. The sound came from the back corner of first class, near the window. Soft, heartbreaking whimpers that seemed to echo off the cabin walls. Richard glanced toward the source and saw her. A small girl, maybe 7 years old, curled into herself like a wounded bird. Her blonde hair fell in tangles around her face, and her tiny shoulders shook with each suppressed sob. Where were her parents? Richard scanned the cabin. Every other passenger seemed oblivious, buried in their phones or tablets. The flight attendants bustled about, preparing for takeoff, but none had noticed the distressed child. Something twisted in Richard's chest, an unfamiliar sensation he'd spent 20 years suppressing. He tried to focus on his laptop, on the quarterly reports that demanded his attention, but those quiet sobs continued, each one like a needle piercing through his carefully constructed armor. Finally, he couldn't stand it anymore. Richard unbuckled his seatbelt and moved toward the girl's row. She sat alone in 6F, pressed against the window, staring out at the tarmac through tear-blurred eyes. Up close, she looked even smaller, more fragile. Her clothes were clean but simple, a faded pink dress and worn sneakers that suggested modest means. "Excuse me," Richard said gently, crouching beside her seat. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" The girl looked up, startled. Her eyes were the deepest blue Richard had ever seen, rimmed red from crying. For a moment they reminded him of someone else, someone he'd tried so hard to forget. "I'm sorry," she whispered, wiping her nose with her sleeve. "I didn't mean to be loud." "You weren't loud at all," Richard assured her. "I'm Richard." "What's your name?" "Emma," she said so quietly he almost missed it. "That's a beautiful name. Are you traveling alone, Emma?" The question seemed to break something inside her. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, and she nodded miserably. Richard felt his world tilt slightly off its axis. "Alone," Richard repeated, certain he'd misheard. No airline would allow a 7-year-old to fly unaccompanied in first class without proper supervision. "Where are your parents, Emma?" The little girl's lower lip trembled as she pulled a crumpled envelope from her small backpack. With shaking hands, she showed him the unaccompanied minor documentation. Richard's business-trained eyes quickly scanned the paperwork. Everything appeared legitimate, but the destination made his blood run cold. "Chicago Children's Services," he read aloud, his voice barely audible over the engines beginning to rev. Emma nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. "My grandma died last week. She was all I had left. The social worker said I have to go to a foster home now because there's nobody else." Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. The words hit him like physical blows, each one reopening wounds he thought had scarred over permanently. 20 years ago, he'd been the one making similar arrangements, standing in sterile government offices, drowning in paperwork while his world crumbled around him. "I'm scared," Emma whispered, so softly he had to lean closer to hear her. "What if they don't like me? What if I do something wrong?" The familiar weight of grief settled on Richard's shoulders like an old, unwelcome friend. He saw himself in this moment, not as the successful businessman who'd built an empire from nothing, but as the broken man who'd lost everything that truly mattered. "Tell me about your grandmother," Richard said, settling into the empty seat beside Emma as the plane began to taxi. Emma's face brightened slightly despite her tears. Grandma Rose was the best cook in all of Oklahoma. She made the most amazing apple pie, and every Sunday we'd sit on her porch swing reading stories together. She taught me how to braid friendship bracelets and how to whistle really loud. As Emma talked, Richard found himself transported to another time, another little girl who'd loved stories and Sunday afternoons. The resemblance wasn't just physical. It was in the way Emma's hands moved when she spoke, the slight tilt of her head when she was thinking. "She sounds wonderful," Richard managed, his throat tight with emotion. "She was sick for a long time," Emma continued, her voice growing smaller. "The doctors said her heart was tired. But she always told me that love never dies, even when people do. She said I'd understand when I was older." The plane lifted off, and Richard watched Chicago's lights grow distant below. Somewhere in that sprawling city, a foster family was preparing to welcome Emma into their home. They were probably good people, he told himself. The system worked better now than it had 20 years ago, but as he looked at Emma's tear-stained face pressed against the window, Richard knew that sometimes good people weren't enough to heal a broken heart. The flight attendant approached with practiced efficiency, her smile faltering when she saw Emma's tears. "Is everything all right here, sir?" "Emma, sweetie, would you like some juice or cookies?" "I'm not hungry," Emma mumbled, still staring out the window at the endless darkness below. Richard watched the flight attendant retreat, noting how quickly she'd shifted from concern to relief when an adult took responsibility. It was a pattern he recognized all too well, the way people distance themselves from other people's pain, especially when children were involved. "Emma," Richard said carefully, "have you been to Chicago before?" She shook her head. "Grandma Rose always wanted to take me there. She said they had the most beautiful buildings that touched the sky, and a lake so big it looked like an ocean. She promised we'd go together when she felt better." Another promise that would never be kept. Richard knew about broken promises, how they accumulated like stones in your chest until breathing became an effort. "The social worker seemed nice," Emma continued, her small voice barely audible over the engine noise. "Mrs. Patterson, she said the Johnsons are a good family. They have 2 boys already, and they live in a house with a big backyard. She showed me pictures." Richard studied Emma's profile as she spoke. There was something eerily familiar about her bone structure, the way her eyebrows drew together when she was worried. It was probably his imagination, trauma playing tricks on his mind. After Sarah's death, he'd seen his daughter's face in every blonde child he encountered for years. "That sounds promising," he offered, though the words felt hollow. "But what if they change their minds?" Emma's voice cracked with fear. "What if I'm too sad or too quiet? Grandma Rose always said I was perfect just the way I am, but what if other people don't think so?" The question hit Richard like a physical blow. He remembered asking similar questions 20 years ago, not about being wanted, but about deserving the loss that had destroyed his family. What if he'd been a better father? What if he'd insisted Sarah wear her seatbelt in the back seat? What if he'd driven that day instead of his wife, Margaret? "Emma," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion, "you are perfect exactly as you are. Anyone would be lucky to have you in their family." She turned to look at him then, her blue eyes studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You're sad too," she observed, with the brutal honesty only children possessed. "I can tell. Your eyes look like mine did in the mirror this morning." Richard felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. This child, this stranger, had seen through 20 years of practiced indifference in a single glance. "Sometimes adults get sad too," he admitted. "About what?" The simple question hung in the air between them like a loaded gun. Richard stared into Emma's innocent blue eyes, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that preceded either a panic attack or a complete emotional breakdown. For 20 years, he'd perfected the art of deflection, of changing subjects and building walls. But something about this 7-year-old girl stripped away his defenses with the efficiency of a surgeon's scalpel. "I had a little girl once," he heard himself say, the words emerging from some deep, protected place he'd sworn never to access again. "She was about your age. Her name was Sarah." Emma's eyes widened with curiosity rather than pity, which somehow made it easier to continue. "She had blonde hair like yours, and she loved stories too. Every night, she'd make me read her 3 books before bed. Never 2, never 4. Always exactly 3. She said it was the perfect number for dreams." "Where is she now?" Emma asked with the innocent directness of childhood. The question Richard had been dreading, the one that had haunted him for 2 decades. He looked out the airplane window at the sea of darkness below and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "She died in a car accident when she was 6 years old. Her mother, my wife Margaret, died too. It was 20 years ago, but sometimes it feels like yesterday." Emma's small hand reached out and touched his arm, a gesture so natural and comforting that Richard nearly broke down completely. When was the last time someone had tried to comfort him? When was the last time he'd allowed himself to be vulnerable enough to need comfort? "I'm sorry," Emma whispered. "That must hurt so much." "It does," Richard admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "I thought if I worked hard enough, made enough money, built enough buildings, the hurt would go away. But it never did." They sat in silence for several minutes, 2 broken souls sharing space above the clouds. Richard found himself studying Emma's profile again, noting the determined set of her small jaw, the way she blinked rapidly when trying not to cry. So much like Sarah, yet uniquely herself. "Mr. Richard?" Emma's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Just Richard is fine, sweetheart. Do you think Sarah would want you to be this sad forever?" The question hit him like lightning. In 20 years of therapy sessions, business meetings and sleepless nights, no one had ever asked him that. Not directly, not with such innocent wisdom. Richard struggled for words. "I don't know. I never really thought about it that way." Emma nodded solemnly, as if she understood concepts far beyond her 7 years. "Grandma Rose told me that people we love never really leave us. They live in our hearts, and they want us to be happy. She said being sad is okay, but staying sad forever makes their hearts hurt too." Richard felt something shift inside his chest, like ice beginning to crack after a long winter. "You're very wise for someone so young," he managed. Emma smiled for the first time since he'd approached her seat, a small, tentative thing, but genuine. "Grandma Rose always said I was an old soul." She was right. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, Richard found himself making mental calculations he hadn't entertained in decades. His penthouse had 3 empty bedrooms. His company's legal department could handle custody arrangements. His bank account could provide Emma with every advantage money could buy. But most importantly, somewhere in the deepest recesses of his heart, he felt something stirring that he'd thought died with Sarah, the fierce, protective instinct of a father. "Emma," he said carefully, "what if there was another option? What if you didn't have to go to the foster family?" She looked at him with those impossibly blue eyes, hope and fear warring across her small features. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if someone else wanted to take care of you, someone who understands what it's like to lose the people you love most?" Emma's breath caught. "You?" The word hung between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they should cross. Richard realized he was offering something he'd sworn never to risk again. His heart, his carefully constructed peace, his protection of a child who could disappear from his life as suddenly as Sarah had. "I know it sounds crazy," Richard continued, his business mind already cataloguing the legal hurdles ahead. "I know we just met, and you don't know anything about me except that I'm sad too. But Emma, I have a big house with lots of books, and I know how to make pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, and I remember what it's like to read exactly 3 bedtime stories." Tears started flowing down Emma's cheeks again, but these were different. Not the hopeless sobs of earlier, but something that looked almost like relief. "But I'm broken," she whispered. "Grandma Rose said I wasn't, but I feel broken inside. What if I can't make you happy? What if I remind you too much of Sarah and make you sadder?" Richard reached out and gently took her small hand in his much larger one. Her fingers were cold and trembling, but they gripped his with surprising strength. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm broken too, but maybe broken people can help fix each other. Maybe that's how healing really works." Emma studied his face intently, as if trying to read his soul. "Would I have my own room, with books? Your own room with as many books as you want. And we could paint the walls any color you choose. Even purple. Especially purple." Richard smiled, feeling rusty muscles in his face remember how to form the expression. "And you wouldn't send me away if I cried sometimes, or if I had nightmares about missing Grandma Rose?" "Never," Richard said firmly. "Crying is how hearts clean themselves, and I have nightmares too sometimes. Maybe we could keep each other company during the scary parts." The plane touched down with a gentle bump, and Richard realized they'd reached more than just their destination. They'd reached a crossroads that neither of them had to face alone. Emma squeezed his hand tighter. "I'd like that very much." But as the seatbelt sign turned off and passengers began gathering their belongings, Richard knew the real journey was just beginning. The Chicago terminal buzzed with late-evening travelers, but Richard barely noticed the crowds as he walked beside Emma toward baggage claim. Her small hand was tucked securely in his, and he found himself adjusting his long stride to match her shorter steps, a consideration he hadn't needed to make in 20 years. "There she is!" a voice called out across the terminal. Richard turned to see a middle-aged woman in a navy blazer approaching them, her smile professional but warm. Behind her stood a couple in their 40s, the man tall and lanky, with kind eyes, the woman petite with laugh lines around her mouth. 2 boys, maybe 9 and 11, flanked their parents, looking curious and slightly bored. "Mrs. Patterson?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "Hello, sweetie," the social worker said, kneeling down to Emma's level. "How was your flight? The Johnsons are so excited to meet you." Richard felt Emma's hand tighten in his, her small body pressing closer to his side. The Johnson family stepped forward with encouraging smiles, but Emma shrank back. "Actually," Richard interjected, his voice carrying the authority he'd developed through decades of boardroom negotiations, "there's been a change of plans." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose. "I'm sorry. Who are you?" "Richard Hartwell," he said, pulling out his business card with practiced efficiency. "I'm Emma's. I'd like to be Emma's guardian." The terminal seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Mrs. Patterson studied the card, Hartwell Industries, CEO, and her expression shifted from confusion to professional caution. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm sure you mean well, but guardian arrangements can't be made spontaneously. There are procedures, background checks, home studies. Emma is scheduled to go home with the Johnsons tonight." "I understand," Richard replied calmly, though his heart was racing. "But I'm prepared to provide whatever documentation you need. My company's legal team can expedite any necessary paperwork. I have financial statements, character references, and I'm willing to undergo any evaluation process required." Mr. Johnson stepped forward, his expression gentle but concerned. We've been preparing for Emma for weeks. We've set up a room, registered her for school. And I'm grateful for your kindness, Richard said sincerely. You seem like wonderful people, but Emma and we connected during the flight. We understand each other's grief. Mrs. Patterson looked down at Emma, who was still pressed against Richard's side. Emma, honey, what do you think about all this? Emma looked up at Richard, then at the Johnson family, then back to Mrs. Patterson. When she spoke, her voice was stronger than it had been all evening. I want to stay with Richard, she said simply. He makes me feel less scared. The social worker sighed, clearly recognizing the complexity of the situation. Mr. Hartwell, even if you're serious about this, and I have to assume you are given your reputation, it could take weeks or months to process a guardianship petition. Emma needs stability now. Then make it temporary, Richard suggested. Emergency custody while we work through the paperwork. I can provide references from senators, federal judges, Fortune 500 CEOs. My background is clean, my resources are unlimited, and my commitment to Emma's welfare is absolute. Mrs. Patterson exchanged glances with the Johnsons, who looked disappointed but understanding. This is highly irregular, she murmured. Sometimes irregular is exactly what's needed, Richard replied, looking down at Emma's hopeful face. But as the adults continued their discussion, none of them noticed the man in the dark suit watching from across the terminal, his phone pressed to his ear, reporting every word of their conversation to someone who had been searching for Emma for a very long time. 3 days later, Richard's penthouse had been transformed. The sterile, minimalist space that once reflected his emotional isolation now buzzed with the chaotic energy of childhood. Emma's purple bedroom was taking shape under the expert hands of interior designers working around the clock. Books lined newly installed shelves, and a window seat overlooked Lake Michigan's endless blue expanse. But the fairy tale atmosphere couldn't mask the tension that had been building since their arrival. Mr. Hartwell, Mrs. Patterson's voice carried strain as she reviewed the stack of legal documents spread across his dining table. I've never seen a guardianship petition move this fast. Your lawyers are exceptionally thorough. Richard smiled grimly. I don't do anything halfway, Mrs. Patterson. Emma deserves security, not bureaucratic delays. Emma sat curled in an oversized armchair nearby, reading one of the dozens of books Richard had ordered. She seemed content, but Richard noticed how she tensed whenever adults discussed her future, as if afraid the dream might evaporate. There's just one concern, Mrs. Patterson continued, lowering her voice. We've had some inquiries about Emma's case, unusual ones. Richard's blood chilled. What kind of inquiries? A private investigator called yesterday, claiming to represent family members who want custody. But according to our records, Emma has no living relatives. Emma's book slipped from her hands, clattering to the floor. That's not possible, she whispered, her face pale. Grandma Rose said we were all alone. She said that's why we had to take care of each other. Mrs. Patterson's expression grew troubled. Emma, sweetie, did your grandmother ever mention your parents? Anything about where you came from before you lived with her? She said my mommy was her daughter, and that my daddy was a good man who lived far away. But they both went to heaven when I was little, so I don't remember them. Richard knelt beside Emma's chair, his protective instincts flaring. What aren't you telling us, Mrs. Patterson? The social worker hesitated, then pulled a manila envelope from her briefcase. The investigator provided documentation suggesting Emma's father might still be alive. If that's true, his parental rights would supersede any guardianship petition. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. After 3 days of imagining a future with Emma, of healing old wounds through new love, the possibility of losing her felt like losing Sarah all over again. Let me see those documents, Richard demanded, his voice sharp with barely controlled panic. But as Mrs. Patterson reached for the envelope. Emma's small voice cut through the tension like a knife. "I lied," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Grandma Rose made me promise never to tell anyone, but I lied about my daddy." The room fell silent except for the sound of Emma's quiet sobbing. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Richard asked gently, though his heart was racing. "Grandma Rose said my daddy was dangerous. She said that's why we had to hide, why we moved so much when I was little. She said if he ever found me, bad things would happen." Richard felt the world shifting beneath his feet once again. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a fire that threatened to consume everything Richard had begun to hope for. He watched Emma's small shoulders shake, with the weight of secrets too heavy for a 7-year-old to carry, and felt rage building in his chest, not at her, but at whatever circumstances had forced a child to live in fear. "Emma," he said softly, moving to sit on the arm of her chair, "you're safe now. Whatever happened before, whatever your grandmother was afraid of, it can't hurt you here." Mrs. Patterson leaned forward, her professional demeanor softening with genuine concern. "Sweetie, can you tell us your daddy's name? Or anything else your grandmother told you about him?" Emma wiped her nose with the back of her hand, looking impossibly young and vulnerable. She called him Vincent Russo. She said he was very rich and very angry, and that he had people who did bad things for him. Richard's blood ran cold. Vincent Russo. The name was familiar from newspaper headlines and FBI investigations. East Coast organized crime, money laundering, violence. If Emma was connected to that world. "Mrs. Patterson," Richard said carefully, "we need to contact the authorities immediately. If Vincent Russo is looking for Emma, she's in danger." But the social worker was already shaking her head, her expression grim. "Mr. Hartwell, if Emma is Vincent Russo's daughter, this becomes a federal matter. The FBI, witness protection, it's completely out of our hands." "No!" Emma cried out, launching herself from the chair into Richard's arms. "I don't want to go away again." "I don't want to hide anymore," Grandma Rose said. "Hiding made her heart tired, and I don't want my heart to be tired too." Richard held her tightly, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, memorizing the weight of her small body against his chest. In just 3 days, she'd become the center of his universe. The piece of his heart he hadn't known was missing. "What if we fought this?" he asked Mrs. Patterson. "What if we refused to hand her over?" "Richard," Mrs. Patterson said gently, using his first name for the first time, "Vincent Russo isn't the kind of man you fight. He's the kind of man you run from." As if summoned by their conversation, Richard's phone buzzed with an unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. Richard Hartwell. The voice on the other end was smooth, cultured, with just a hint of Brooklyn accent. "Mr. Hartwell, my name is Vincent Russo. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Emma went rigid in Richard's arms, her face draining of all color. Even through the phone speaker, she'd recognized the voice from her nightmares. "I don't know what you're talking about," Richard said evenly, though his heart was pounding. "My daughter, Mr. Hartwell, Emma Rose Russo. Her grandmother kidnapped her 7 years ago, and I've been searching for her ever since. I understand you've grown, attached, during your brief acquaintance, but she belongs with her family." "Her family?" Richard's voice rose with anger. "From what I understand, you terrified a dying woman into fleeing across the country with a baby." "That doesn't sound like family to me." Vincent's laugh was cold as winter steel. "You don't know the whole story, Mr. Hartwell, but you will. I'm in Chicago now, and I'll be collecting my daughter tomorrow. I suggest you don't interfere." The line went dead, leaving Richard staring at his phone while Emma trembled in his arms. "He found me," she whispered. "Grandma Rose said he always finds what he's looking for." Richard's penthouse transformed into a fortress overnight. Security specialists swept for bugs, installed additional cameras, and positioned armed guards at every entrance. Richard's head of security, Marcus Webb, a former Navy SEAL with 20 years of corporate protection experience, briefed him on Vincent Russo's methods. "He's old-school Italian-American organized crime," Marcus explained, spreading surveillance photos across Richard's desk. "Runs loan sharking, money laundering, protection rackets up and down the eastern seaboard. But here's the thing, he's never been connected to violence against children. His reputation is built on a twisted sense of family honor." Emma had barely slept, curled up in Richard's guest room with every light on, jumping at every sound from the street 40 floors below. Richard sat beside her bed through the night, reading story after story, until his voice grew hoarse. Anything to keep the shadows at bay. "Tell me about that night again," Richard said to Mrs. Patterson as she arrived the next morning with a federal agent in tow. The night Emma's grandmother took her. Agent Sarah Chen was compact and efficient, her dark eyes missing nothing as she assessed the security measures Richard had implemented. "According to our files, Vincent Russo's wife, Maria, died in childbirth 7 years ago. Emma's grandmother, Rose Martinez, was Maria's mother. She'd been helping care for the baby. Then one night, Rose disappeared with Emma. Russo reported it as kidnapping, claimed his mother-in-law was mentally unstable with grief. But Rose never contacted authorities, never asked for help. She just vanished." Emma looked up from her coloring book, her small voice cutting through the adult conversation. "Grandma Rose said my mommy made her promise to keep me safe. She said my mommy visited her in a dream and told her my daddy's sadness was turning into something dark and scary." Agent Chen exchanged glances with Mrs. Patterson. "Emma, did your grandmother ever tell you why she was afraid of your father? Did he hurt you when you were little?" Emma shook her head. "I don't remember him. But Grandma Rose would have bad dreams sometimes, and she'd wake up crying, saying, 'Not Emma, please not Emma.' She said some kinds of love can turn into cages." Richard felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd seen it in business, how grief could twist men into monsters, how loss could justify any action if it meant avoiding more pain. "Mr. Hartwell," Agent Chen continued, "we can offer Emma witness protection, but given her age and circumstances, she'd likely end up in the foster system anyway. Russo has never been convicted of anything directly, and paternal rights are difficult to override without evidence of abuse." "So what are you telling me?" Richard demanded. "That we just hand over a terrified child to a man who drove her grandmother to flee in the middle of the night?" "I'm telling you that legally, Vincent Russo has every right to his daughter, and illegally, he has the resources to take her whether we cooperate or not." As if on cue, Richard's phone rang. Vincent Russo again. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm downstairs in your lobby. I think it's time we had a face-to-face conversation about Emma's future. And Mr. Hartwell, I'm not leaving Chicago without my daughter." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Richard could see black SUVs positioned around his building. Vincent Russo had come prepared for war. But so had Richard. The elevator doors opened with a whisper, and Vincent Russo stepped into Richard's penthouse like a man entering his own kingdom. He was smaller than Richard had expected, perhaps 5'8", silver-haired, wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit. But his presence filled the room with an energy that made everyone unconsciously step back. Everyone except Richard. "Vincent Russo," the man said, extending his hand with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You have a beautiful home, Mr. Hartwell. Very secure." Richard didn't take the offered hand. "Where's Emma?" "Safe in her room with Agent Chen," Mrs. Patterson answered quickly. "Mr. Russo, as I explained on the phone, there are proper channels for custody disputes." Vincent's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Mrs. Patterson, with respect, this isn't a custody dispute. This is a father reclaiming his stolen daughter from kidnappers and well-meaning but misguided strangers." "Emma doesn't remember you," Richard said flatly. "She's terrified of you. What kind of father inspires that level of fear in his own child? For the first time, Vincent's composure cracked slightly. "You have no idea what I've been through, Mr. Hartwell. 7 years of searching, 7 years of wondering if my daughter was alive or dead. 7 years of living with the guilt that my grief over Maria's death pushed Rose to desperate measures. Then why didn't you stop searching? Why didn't you give Emma the space to heal?" Vincent moved to the window, gazing out at the city he'd traveled across to reclaim his daughter. "Because she's all I have left of Maria. Because every day without her is another day of dying inside." The raw pain in Vincent's voice caught Richard off guard. He recognized it, the same desperate grief that had driven him to bury himself in work for 20 years, the same crushing need to hold on to anything that connected him to his lost family. "But Emma isn't Maria," Richard said quietly. "She's her own person, with her own fears and dreams. And right now she dreams of staying here with me." Vincent turned back to face him, and Richard saw something dangerous flicker in the older man's eyes. "You've known my daughter for 4 days, Mr. Hartwell. I've loved her for 7 years. Love?" Richard's voice rose with anger. "You call terrorizing a child love? You call making an old woman so afraid that she'd rather live as a fugitive than let you near Emma? You call that love? You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Richard interrupted. "I understand because I lived it. I lost my wife and daughter 20 years ago, and I know what that kind of grief can do to a man. I know how easy it is to convince yourself that control is the same thing as protection, that possession is the same thing as love." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Vincent's controlled breathing. "But here's what I learned too late," Richard continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Love isn't about holding on so tight that you crush what you're trying to protect. Love is about wanting what's best for the other person, even when it breaks your heart." Vincent stared at him for a long moment, then walked to the hallway that led to Emma's room. "Emma," he called softly, "can Daddy see you for just a minute?" The sound that came from Emma's room was pure terror, a scream that seemed to tear from her very soul. And in that moment, Richard knew exactly what he had to do. Emma's scream cut through the penthouse like a siren, bringing Agent Chen and Mrs. Patterson running. But it was Richard who reached her first, gathering her into his arms as she sobbed with the kind of primal fear that came from the deepest corners of memory. "Make him go away," she pleaded, her small hands fisting in Richard's shirt. "Please make him go away. I don't want to remember any more." Vincent stood frozen in the doorway, his face a mask of devastation as he watched his daughter recoil from him in terror. "Emma, baby, it's Daddy. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to take you home." "This is my home," Emma cried, her voice breaking. "Richard is my family now. You're the scary man from the dreams." "What dreams?" Agent Chen asked sharply, her hand moving instinctively toward her weapon. Emma looked up at Richard, seeking permission or strength. He nodded encouragingly, and she took a shuddering breath. "The dreams, where the angry man hurts Grandma Rose. Where he yells and throws things and makes Mommy cry. Grandma Rose said they were just dreams, but she'd cry too when I told her about them." Vincent went white as paper. That's not possible. You were barely 6 months old when Maria died. You couldn't remember." "Children remember more than we think," Agent Chen said quietly. "Especially trauma. Even infants can retain emotional imprints of violence or fear." "I never hurt Maria," Vincent protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "I loved her more than life itself." "But you hurt others," Richard said, the pieces falling into place. And Emma saw it. A baby might not understand words, but they understand fear, violence, the sound of their mother crying. Mrs. Patterson pulled out her phone, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone on the other end. Richard caught fragments: emergency custody review and immediate psychological evaluation. Vincent sank into a chair, his head in his hands. I'd never wanted her to be afraid of me. Everything I did, all the business, the darker aspects of my work, I kept it away from home. I thought I was protecting them. But you brought it home anyway, Richard said, not unkindly. Violence has a way of following us, even when we think we've contained it. So what now? Vincent asked, his voice hollow. You keep my daughter, and I go back to New York with nothing. Richard looked down at Emma, who had stopped crying but still clung to him like a lifeline. That's not my decision to make. It's Emma's. I'm 7 years old, Emma said quietly. I'm not supposed to make decisions like this. No, Richard agreed. You're not. But you're also the only one who knows what feels safe and what doesn't, what feels like love and what feels like fear. Emma studied Vincent's face, really looked at him for the first time since he'd arrived. You look sad, she observed, with that startling directness children possessed. Like Richard did on the airplane. Vincent's eyes filled with tears. I am sad, baby girl. I've been sad for 7 years. But your sad is different than Richard's sad. Richard's sad makes him want to take care of people. Your sad makes people scared. The truth of it hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. Vincent stood slowly, his hands shaking as he reached into his jacket. For a terrifying moment, Richard tensed, ready to shield Emma with his body. But Vincent pulled out a small velvet box. This was your mother's, he said, holding out the box to Emma. I've been carrying it for 7 years, waiting to give it to you. Emma looked at Richard, who nodded encouragingly. She slipped from his arms and approached Vincent cautiously, like a wild animal testing the safety of an offered hand. The box contained a delicate gold locket with a tiny photograph inside. A young woman with Emma's blue eyes and gentle smile. She loved you so much, Vincent whispered. And I loved her so much that when I lost her, I forgot how to love anything else properly. Emma held the locket carefully, studying her mother's face. She's beautiful, just like you. For a moment, father and daughter stood in silence, connected by grief and memory and the fragile hope of possibility. Then Emma spoke the words that would change everything. I want to remember my mommy, Emma said softly, clutching the locket against her chest, but I don't want to be scared anymore. Vincent knelt down to her level, careful not to move too quickly. What if Daddy went away for a while? What if I learned how to not be scary anymore? Emma tilted her head, considering this with the serious concentration of childhood. How long is a while? However long it takes, Vincent replied, his voice thick with emotion. However long it takes for you to feel safe with me, if that day ever comes. Richard watched the exchange with a mixture of hope and heartbreak. He'd spent 4 days imagining a future with Emma, but now he could see a different possibility emerging, one that might be better for everyone, even if it meant sacrificing his own newfound happiness. Vincent, Richard said carefully, what if it didn't have to be all or nothing? Both Vincent and Emma turned to look at him. What if Emma stayed here while you worked on yourself, got help for the grief, distanced yourself from the dangerous parts of your business? And what if, when Emma felt ready, she could visit, get to know her father gradually, safely? Agent Chen stepped forward. That would require a very unusual custody arrangement. Joint guardianship with supervised visitation, psychological evaluations, regular check-ins. I have the best lawyers in Chicago, Richard said. Vincent probably has equally good lawyers in New York. Between us, we can make it work legally. Vincent was quiet for a long moment, studying his daughter's face. And if she never feels ready? If she decides she wants to stay with you permanently? Richard felt his heart clench, but he forced himself to meet Vincent's eyes. Then that's what happens. Love means wanting what's best for Emma, not what's easiest for us. Emma looked back and forth between the two men, the father she'd never known and the guardian who'd become her protector in just 4 days. Could I call you both Daddy? The question hung in the air like a prayer. Vincent's tears finally spilled over. I don't know if I deserve that. Grandma Rose always said people deserve what they work for, Emma replied with startling wisdom. Not what they want, but what they work for. Mrs. Patterson was already pulling out paperwork, her practical mind shifting into problem-solving mode. We'll need psychological evaluations for everyone, background checks updated, a formal custody mediation. But it's possible? Richard asked. With enough lawyers and enough patience? Yes, it's possible. Vincent stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. I'll go back to New York tomorrow. I'll start working on myself. Therapy, whatever it takes. And maybe when you're ready. Maybe, Emma agreed. But I want to stay here with Richard. This feels like home. Richard knelt down and pulled Emma into his arms, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. 4 days ago, he'd been a broken man drowning in 20 years of grief. Now he was still broken, but no longer alone. We'll take it one day at a time, he whispered into her hair. Vincent moved toward the elevator, then paused. Richard, thank you for seeing what was best for her instead of what was easiest for you. As the elevator doors closed, Emma looked up at Richard with those impossibly blue eyes that had started this whole journey. Are you still sad? She asked. Richard considered the question seriously. I'm still sad about Sarah and Margaret. I probably always will be, but I'm not lonely anymore. And sometimes, when I look at you, I remember what hope feels like. Emma smiled, that same tentative expression that had first cracked his heart on the airplane. Grandma Rose always said that hearts are like gardens. They need love and time and patience to grow beautiful things. Your Grandma Rose was very wise. And now we get to grow a family together. A different kind of family, but still a real one. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago's lights twinkled like stars, and Richard realized that sometimes the most unexpected journeys led to the most extraordinary destinations. He'd boarded a plane as a lonely millionaire and landed as a father, guardian, and protector of a little girl, who taught him that healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about being brave enough to build a future. Emma yawned and snuggled closer. Will you read me exactly 3 bedtime stories tonight? Always, Richard promised. Always exactly 3. And for the first time in 20 years, Richard Hartwell went to sleep believing in tomorrow.